This is the new Fujifilm X-M5, and for the past week, I've been using this camera across Tokyo. Never before in my time with photography has there been a camera that I feel so conflicted by. There are elements of this camera that I absolutely love, and elements that leave me frustrated and confused. I think there are two distinct sides to this camera. The technical side, like its sensor, the images it can produce, and its video capabilities, and its user experience side. That being its ergonomics, frustrating design choices, and overall usability. Let's start with the more boring, albeit just as important technical side, as this is the aspect that I think they absolutely nailed in this camera. The X-M5 comes with the 26.1 megapixel CMOS X-Trans 4 sensor. This is the exact same sensor which has been used for 7 years now with the X-T4, the X100V, and the X Pro 3, just to name a few. All of which are much more expensive cameras than this, mind you, with this having an MSRP of just $800. That sensor is paired with Fuji's fast X Processor 5, meaning that in my entire time with this camera, it's always felt snappy and responsive. Put together, that gives this camera plenty of resolution to still do some cropping and stills, and it lets this camera do 6.2K open gate footage at 30 frames per second, 10-bit color. This camera also has a full-size mic jack, albeit in a strange spot, a full-size headphone jack, and USB-C port for charging. It also has a small HDMI port, micro or mini HDMI, one of them. Even when paired with a lens, this camera is exceptionally small. Now, it's not going to fit in your pants pocket by any means, but throughout my entire trip in Tokyo, I had multiple moments where I didn't really want to take my full camera bag with me, and this slipped right into my jacket pocket without any concern. I was also impressed by this camera's battery life. For being so small, this one battery got me through the entire day of hybrid video and photo shooting and rarely fell past 2 bars. At night, I would just charge it with that USB-C port, so I never even took an external battery charger, and it was very convenient. In addition to that, you're also getting a 1 million dot LCD screen. Now, I do have some issues with the touchscreen that we will get to in a little bit, but for right now, this is a bright, responsive touchscreen, and I really like how Fujifilm lets you swipe up, down, left, or right, and use that as if it were a physical button. I think that's really cool. Overall, I think it feels really snappy, and being able to fold the screen outward like this would make it perfect for vlogging if it had IBIS. Something that this camera does not have is any form of in-body image stabilization. So for photos, you're going to have to rely on your ISO for low light photography, and for video, you're going to have to rely on digital stabilization or a gimbal. Regardless of whether it's because of this camera's size or the price point, this is one of the few technical aspects of the camera that I really would have liked to see changed. In addition to its film dial, which we'll get to in a little bit, and the mode dial, this camera has 2 customizable dials, one on the front, which also acts as a button, and one on the top. The one that acts as a button, I do have a slight gripe with, and that is when I'm holding this camera, you can see my finger just naturally goes over it, and I would constantly find that as I'm walking around, I was pressing this button. I think they might have been able to add a little bit more resistance to this dial, or maybe even make it so the top dial is the one that pushes in and this one doesn't, and I think that would have been a huge improvement. But overall, these 2 dials feel very responsive, and I like that when paired with one of Fujifilm's native lenses like this, that has an aperture ring, you are getting every part of the exposure triangle as a physical control, not having to dive into menus. I really like that. The last part of this camera that I want to talk positively about are the images that it can produce. Now, I might be a little bit biased here because this is the same sensor that I've been using for half a decade now, and the one that you're even watching right now in my X-T4. But I think the images that come out of this look sharp, have plenty of resolution, and have that signature Fujifilm look that I really like. And when you pair that with the new X Processor 5, you get images that you can really push the ISO on. Again, thankfully, because this doesn't have image stabilization. I think that this sensor can put out really nice looking video as well. The 6.2K open gate looks great at 10-bit, and I really like the F-Log file format. I think that it is so impressive that Fujifilm managed to cram so much into a camera this small and so cheap. However, there are quite a few things on the user experience side which really hurt my experience with this camera. There are a few things that I don't like about this camera, and all of them come down to how Fujifilm chose to use the limited space that they had to work with. Immediately, I'd like to show you an older Fujifilm camera, the XA2. The X-M5 may as well be a continuation of the XA line, and if you look at these cameras, they have virtually the same footprint. Now, what I really want to show you here is look at the difference in the thumb grip size for both of these cameras. See how the X-M5 is about half the size of the XA2's. And take a look at when I hold the XA2 that there is a direct line between my thumb and my finger when gripping it. And now take a look at the X-M5 and see how there isn't that same line. And the problem with this is when I squeeze this camera, it twists in on itself. This little change to the grip, in my opinion, feels horrible, and in my opinion makes this one of the few cameras where I actively feel like I'm going to drop it because of the grip. To make up for that, I'm constantly moving my thumb from the grip over to the side, which starts to nudge the touchscreen. And if you see here, that is the touchscreen control button. So even if I have the touchscreen functions off, because I'm adjusting my grip, I'm then switching it to autofocus and even to take photos whenever I touch the touchscreen. It's very frustrating. Looking back to the XA again for a moment, you'll notice below its thumb grip are all buttons. Whereas you'll notice on the X-M5, below its thumb grip is a control stick. And what that leads to is when you're holding the camera with your thumb on the thumb grip, your knuckle is constantly hitting that control stick, which for me led to me holding up my camera and finding that my focus point was in the bottom right hand corner. And then you combine this again with the front dial that I mentioned before, which is also a button that when you press it in, it changes its function. So what this led to time after time was me pulling up my camera. It's already taking photos because my thumb nudged the touchscreen in the wrong way. It's taking photos with the bottom right hand corner in focus. And when I go to change a setting, which this should do, it's actually switched itself over to the film simulation dial. No joke, throughout this trip, I think it was a solid 50-50 if I pulled up my camera and it was the way that I left it last time I used it. I do think a third-party grip would really help with this. However, then you'd be adding additional size to the camera, which at that point, why wouldn't you just buy something like an X-T3, which is an older camera with the same sensor and already has a larger grip? As crazy as it sounds, I would prefer a smaller screen if it meant that I could hold this camera reliably and not have it constantly change my settings. Moving on to something that I'm not outright mad about, but I am very torn on, is this camera's defining feature, that being the film dial. Now in concept, I think that this is very cool. It gives you a physical point of control for Fujifilm's film simulations, which they've become very known for at this point, and it's unique to this camera. The problem that I have with it is that I just didn't end up using it throughout this trip. I don't shoot in JPEG, I shoot in RAW. And for anyone who doesn't know, the film simulations don't get applied to your RAW photos. You can apply them after the fact in Lightroom, but they don't get applied by default. I'm fully willing to accept that I am the minority and this is a cool feature for most people who this camera is targeted at. But if you are the type of person to shoot RAW, I think that this dial ultimately won't do anything for you. The last thing that I'll bring up as a negative for this camera, which I've already mentioned, is the lack of in-body stabilization. I understand that there were probably either technical or, again, financial concerns about this, but it really is a disappointment for a camera that has so many fantastic video features that it doesn't have this one, which would make a huge difference. If you're just taking photos, the X Processor 5 will probably give you enough ISO room that you're not really going to feel the struggle of not having in-body stabilization. This camera ultimately left me feeling very frustrated because I think that it is so close to perfection for what it is, but because of its small issues, it left a terribly sour taste in my mouth. I just can't state how frustrating it is to have a camera that you feel like you're going to drop whenever you use it and is constantly changing your settings based on its poor grip. It makes every moment of using it noticeably worse. So no matter how good the technology is in it, and no matter how close it gets to perfection, Having it always be uncomfortable is just something that I can't get behind. I hope that I'm the minority here, because outside of that, this camera is really cool, and for its price, it's almost unbeatable. If you're able to find a physical copy of this camera and go and hold it before you buy it and you like it, I would fully recommend this camera. Again, this might just be me. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless.